A sweating general behind a broken wall, a harbor full of ruined tea. A printer setting rebellion in neat little rows of type. That was the American Revolution far more often than the marble statue version people remember. The shock is not that colonists fought Britain. It is how much of the war survived on confusion, borrowed money-patched clothing, and people arguing their way toward an outcome nobody could fully see. So, what exactly got scrubbed out of the classroom version? The deeper you go, the messier, stranger, and more revealing the revolution becomes. 1. Long before musket smoke filled New England, the bill for Britain's last global war was already sitting on the table. The 7 Years' War had expanded British power and British debt at the same time, and London decided the colonies should help pay the tab. In imperial logic, that sounded tidy. In colonial life, it felt like Parliament had discovered them mainly when the invoice was ready. 2. At the start, plenty of colonists were not demanding independence at all. They were demanding the rights of British subjects, which made the early argument look less like a clean breakup and more like a family lawsuit conducted across an ocean. For a while, many people wanted the king to rescue them from Parliament. The empire was not yet the enemy in one simple piece. 3. Independence was never a unanimous neighborhood opinion. In 1776, the colonies held patriots, loyalists, and a very large middle group that preferred surviving the weak to making history. Some wanted liberty, some wanted order, some wanted to stop having soldiers in town. The revolution looks cleaner in retrospect because winners get the final edit and fence-sitters rarely end up in paintings. 4. Spinning wheels mattered more than school posters usually admit. When British imports were boycotted, women turned homespun cloth into a political statement, and suddenly getting dressed could function as economic warfare. A plain domestic object became a public argument. The revolution was fought with pamphlets and muskets, yes, but also with thread, laundry household budgets, and a refusal to shop like nothing had changed. 5. On King Street in Boston, the event later branded as the Boston Massacre began as a tense street confrontation, not a perfectly staged moral tableau. Snowballs, insults, panic, and soldiers under pressure turned one ugly encounter into propaganda within days. Paul Revere's famous engraving cleaned up the chaos and sharpened the blame. The revolution learned early that an image can mobilize faster than a careful explanation. 6. The Tea Act did not simply make tea more expensive. In one of history's great public relations disasters, it actually lowered the price of East India Company tea while keeping Parliament's right to tax intact. That was the real irritant. Cheap tea with a principle attached still tasted like submission. The problem was never just the cup. It was who got to say why the cup was on the table. 7. In Boston Harbor, the tea dumped overboard came to 342 chests, and nobody on the wharf could mistake the gesture for a minor customer complaint. The men who boarded the ships used disguise, discipline, and remarkable restraint about private property not connected to the cargo. They were destroying tea, not starting a random riot. Even rebellion at this stage still wanted to look organized enough for witnesses. 8. Punishment from London was supposed to isolate Massachusetts. Instead, the coercive acts helped turn local anger into continental solidarity. Close support tighten authority, and suddenly distant colonies start imagining their own future under the same treatment. Repression can clarify a pattern faster than a speech can. Britain tried to make an example. It accidentally distributed a warning label to the rest of British America. 9. In carpentered rooms far from any battlefield, the First Continental Congress gathered men who did not yet agree on independence, but did agree that something was badly wrong. They coordinated boycotts, drafted grievances, and created a habit of acting together. That mattered. Before the war became a military problem, it had to become an organizational one. Revolutions need meetings too, however disappointing that sounds to the sword and drum crowd. 10. Even after blood had already been spilled, Congress still sent the Olive Branch Petition to George III in 1775. The message was essentially, "Things have gone badly, but perhaps we can still fix this without tearing the empire apart." The king refused to treat the colonies as misled children anymore. He treated them as open rebels. One of the most startling facts about the revolution is how long people kept reaching for the emergency exit marked reconciliation. 11. Then Thomas Paine arrived with a pamphlet and set fire to the moderate middle. Common sense did not sound like elite political theory. It sounded like someone in the room had finally stopped pretending monarchy was normal. Plain language widened the audience, and widened audiences change history. A complicated constitutional dispute suddenly fit into everyday speech. That is when rebellion stopped sounding temporary and started sounding like an answer. 12. The vote for independence happened on July 2, 1776, which means John Adams was technically wrong in an extremely American way when he predicted the wrong date would be celebrated forever. Congress approved the Declaration's wording on July 4th, and that became the symbol the country kept. History loves the cleaner label. The paperwork, as usual, took several steps, but the calendar only had room for one legend. 13. The Declaration was not signed by everyone on July 4th, despite generations of paintings insisting otherwise. Most delegates signed later, and some names were added weeks after the dramatic date schoolchildren memorize. The famous moment of universal quill and ink bravery is largely a retrospective convenience. The Revolution kept producing those slow, uneven processes later compressed into one perfect scene so nobody had to explain committee timing. Saffert-Sitters. 14. Through the dark roads of April 1775, Paul Revere was important. But he was not a lone cinematic warning siren. William Dawes rode too. So did Samuel Prescott, who actually completed the ride to Concord after the others were intercepted. Early American memory had room for one-star rider and not much patience for ensemble casting. The cause was collective. The legend kept looking for a lead role. 15. The British Are Coming makes fine children's theater, but it was probably not what Revere shouted. Most colonists still considered themselves British, and a stealth mission loses value when you announce it like a marching band cue. He likely warned that regular troops were moving. The polished phrase survived because it draws the lines more cleanly than the messy truth did. National myths adore dialogue that sounds pre-written. 16. On the road to Lexington and Concord, nobody can say with certainty who fired the first shot. That uncertainty is not a glitch in the story. It is the story. Tension, fear, and armed men in poor light produced a moment that immediately outran documentation. The revolution began in part inside confusion. An empire and a rebellion were born into one of history's most important unanswered questions. 17. When Congress chose George Washington to command the Continental Army, it was not just selecting a tall man on horseback. It was making a political map. A Virginian leading New England troops made the resistance look continental rather than local, which was crucial if the cause was going to outgrow Massachusetts. Military skill mattered. So did regional symbolism. The Revolution kept solving practical problems with theatrical casting. 18. Behind broken earthworks and drifting smoke around New York in 1776. Washington often looked less like a stone-faced icon and more like an exhausted manager holding together a dissolving project. Militiamen where green terms of service were short. British pressure was relentless, and retreat followed retreat. The astonishing part is not that he looked worried. The astonishing part is that the army survived long enough for worry to become strategy. 19. Losing New York should have wrecked the American cause, and yet Washington kept slipping away before the trap fully snapped shut. A nighttime withdrawal from Brooklyn, helped by fog and discipline, preserved the core of the army when destruction felt one bad hour away. In a war like this, survival counted as a form of victory. The revolution did not advance in one line. It backed away repeatedly and refused to disappear. 23. The Delaware crossing was dramatic, but it was not a single isolated miracle with a neat bow on top. Washington crossed on Christmas night, struck Trenton, then moved again and won at Princeton days later. The sequence mattered because momentum mattered. One bold move became several, and several repaired morale. The army was not saved by one painting. It was saved by not stopping after the first gamble paid off. 21. At Trenton, the Hessians were not simply drunk and asleep in a snow globe of carelessness. That story lasted because it flatters the surprise and makes the victory sound cleaner than it was. In reality, they were tired under pressure and still caught off balance by speed and weather. The revolution produced many useful simplifications. This one turned a hard military success into a smug holiday anecdote. 22. By the end of 1776, enlistments were set to expire, which meant the Continental Army could have dissolved on paper, while the British still stood in the field. Washington begged, persuaded, and offered bounties to keep men a little longer. Liberty kept coming due at the worst possible times. The war was not only about winning battles. It was about convincing enough people not to go home before the next one. 23. Winter roads, frozen camps, and empty supply lines turned clothing into a military issue with teeth. Continental soldiers often lacked shoes, blankets, and proper coats, which meant endurance itself became a weapon the army had to manufacture daily. Bare feet leave memorable prints in patriotic storytelling for a reason. Shortages were visible. So was the discipline required to keep marching anyway when the ground kept charging interest. 24. Smallpox was so dangerous to 18th century armies because crowded camps turned disease into a recruitment officer for the graveyard. Washington eventually ordered widespread inoculation for his troops, a risky decision that still made more sense than letting the virus choose the campaign schedule. It was one of his most consequential commands. The revolution was not only fought against redcoats, it was also fought against microbes that did not care about ideology. 25. Camp life was never just men drilling and officers posing for portraits. Women cooked, washed, nursed, mended, carried supplies, and kept military households functioning in conditions that were miserable even before the weather turned personal. Some followed husbands, some worked for wages, some simply had nowhere else to go. The army that later marched through textbooks was held together in no small part by labor those textbooks often mention in passing and then hurry past. So far, the revolution looks less like a polished founding myth and more like an underfunded operation held together by cloth, rumor, and timed panic. The stranger part is how much wider the pattern gets. 26. Along roads leading toward British lines, enslaved people made some of the most dangerous choices in the entire war. The revolution opened cracks in the system, and people trapped inside slavery tried to run through them. Freedom was not a slogan to them. It was a route, a gamble, a rumor worth testing. The war over liberty kept forcing the colonies to reveal whom that word actually included. 27. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, promised freedom to enslaved men who escaped rebel masters and joined the British cause. The proclamation terrified slaveholders and exposed a brutal contradiction at the center of patriot rhetoric. Suddenly, the side speaking most loudly about liberty had a reason to fear that liberty might spread beyond its preferred audience. Few wartime documents turned ideology against practice more efficiently than that one. 28. Native nations did not line up neatly under a British or American banner because their political world was older, local, and far more strategic than later patriotic stories allow. They judged which side posed the greater threat to land trade and survival. Many saw settler expansion, not parliamentary taxation, as the deeper problem. The revolution was a fight for independence to some people and a dangerous border crisis to others. 29. Inside the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, the war opened fractures that had lasting consequences. Some nations supported the British, others like the Oneida and Tuscarora supported the Americans. A powerful diplomatic union was pulled apart by a conflict not of its own making. Independence for the new United States came paired with devastation for Native communities. That is one of the revolution's least convenient but most important truths. 30. Before France publicly embraced the American cause, French aid was already moving through shadowy channels. Powder weapons and money arrived through commercial fronts and quiet arrangements. Because great powers enjoy plausible deniability almost as much as they enjoy weakening rivals. The American Revolution had underground supply chains before it had certainty, even in its heroic phase. The cause was borrowing from geopolitics and hoping the paperwork stayed discreet. 31. Saratoga in 1777 mattered because it convinced France the Americans might actually pull this off. A rebel victory is inspiring. A rebel victory that looks sustainable attracts navies, loans, and diplomats with better coats. Once France formally allied with the United States, The war stopped being a colonial disturbance and became part of a global struggle. Britain was no longer managing one insurgency. It was juggling an entire imperial emergency. 32. Spain never became a formal ally of the United States the way France did, but it still aided the anti-British effort in ways that mattered enormously. Money moved, pressure mounted in other theaters. Bernardo de Galvez campaigned along the Gulf Coast and helped stretch British resources thinner. The revolution was beginning to look less like 13 colonies finding themselves and more like Britain finding itself overbooked across several maps. 33. The Dutch entered the financial side of the story too, and that matters because wars run on credit almost as reliably as they run on courage. American agents needed loans, Europe's bankers watched the conflict, and money became another battlefield hidden behind polite clothes and careful signatures. Liberty, it turns out, could be extremely expensive. The revolution's ideals traveled best when somebody could still cover shipping. Powder and pay. 34. Lafayette arrived young, rich, restless, and wildly committed to a cause that was not originally his. His presence gave the American war glamour in France, but it also delivered something more useful than glamour, a living human bridge between the Continental cause and French power. He became both symbol and connector. The revolution kept attracting figures who looked like characters first and logistical assets second, even when both roles mattered equally. 35. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin operated like a diplomatic weather system. Fur cap, plain style, old man genius. Strategic charm, he knew exactly how to market America to a French audience that loved theater as much as policy. He was negotiating aid, but he was also performing credibility. The revolution needed cannons, yes. It also needed Europe to find the rebellion fashionable enough to finance, before it became respectable enough to endorse. 36. Drill at Valley Forge became legendary, not because Baron von Steuben arrived with magical European sternness, but because he translated military discipline into a form the Continental Army could actually use. He taught by demonstration repetition and practical simplification. Training mattered because battle stress punishes confusion instantly. The Army did not transform overnight. It just became harder to rattle, which in a long war is a difference large enough to see from across a field. 37. Privateers blurred the line between patriotic entrepreneurship and legal piracy in a way the 18th century considered perfectly reasonable. American vessels armed with government authorization captured British merchant ships and turned maritime harassment into revenue. Hundreds of prizes changed hands over the course of the war. The revolution, in other words, outsourced part of its naval nuisance capacity to profit motive, which is an astonishingly durable American management style. 38. Continental paper money circulated fast and lost value even faster, giving the new nation one of the most famous economic insults in its language. Not worth a continental. Print too much currency without reliable tax backing, and inflation will perform the lesson with no mercy at all. People were paid in bills that shrank while they were still folded in a pocket. Liberty had a cash flow problem almost from birth. 39. British officials understood exactly how fragile American finance was, which is why counterfeiting continental currency became part of the war. Flood a shaky system with fake notes, and you do not need to win every battle to deepen the trouble. Monetary trust depends on confidence, and confidence is easier to shred than rebuild. Some of the revolution's damage happened with presses, paper, and quiet circulation rather than marching columns. 40. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could request money and supplies from the states, but it could not directly tax them into obedience. That turned wartime administration into a recurring exercise in begging with formal stationery. States answered unevenly, late or not enough. The government was trying to run a war with authority that often stopped at the edge of a strongly worded letter. Coordination kept arriving half-dressed. 41. Quotas and requisitions turned the states into reluctant business partners in a project. They kept demanding more than they wanted to give. One state dragged its feet. Another sent partial support. A third argued about fairness while soldiers waited. This was not just bureaucracy being dull. It was strategy being starved by local interest. The Revolution revealed long before the Constitution how quickly unity becomes decorative when the bill has to be split 13 ways. 42. When the British captured Philadelphia in 1777, they took the capital city, but not the cause. Congress packed up and kept moving, because a revolution tied too tightly to one building is a revolution begging to be shut with a key. Cities mattered symbolically, yet political persistence mattered more. The American side kept proving a frustrating lesson. Occupying a place is easier than repossessing the argument that left it. 43. British occupation of New York lasted for most of the war, turning the city into a military base, a refuge, a prison hub, and a reminder that the Revolution did not control every major space it later claimed as ancestral theater. While patriotic memory likes forward momentum, reality included long stretches of enemy occupation in one of the colony's most important urban centers. Independents spent years coexisting with a British flag in Manhattan. 44. Off New York prison ships became floating nightmares of crowding, disease, hunger, and despair. Conditions were so bad that captivity itself could feel like a slow sentence measured in heat. Rot and breathless air. More Americans died in British custody there than most people ever learn in school. The Revolution contained horrors that did not fit cleanly into battlefield heroics, so memory often pushed them out to the edge of the frame. 45. More soldiers died from disease than from direct combat during the war, which is the kind of fact that instantly rearranges the heroic composition. Camps, marches, dirty water, poor nutrition, and inadequate sanitation did what many battles could not. Armies of the era were biological disasters waiting for transport. If you want a more truthful portrait of the Revolution, place fewer bayonets in the center and more fever cough and contaminated ground around them. 46. Molly Pitcher is famous, but she is best understood as a composite figure built from the wartime labor and courage of several women rather than one perfectly documented heroine with a tidy script. The story survives because it captures something true even while the details blur. Women were there under fire. They carried water-aided crews and stepped into danger. History sometimes preserves reality by wrapping it in one memorable name. 47. Deborah Sampson, by contrast, gives the Revolution a very specific documented shock. She disguised herself as a man and served in the Continental Army, navigating the brutal practicalities of military life while protecting her identity. The fact matters not because it was common, but because it proves how much the war destabilized ordinary categories. A supposedly fixed world had become flexible enough for necessity, ambition, and secrecy to share a uniform. It was 48. At Monmouth in 1778, heat itself became a combatant. Men collapsed under the summer conditions, and the battlefield looked like one long argument between endurance and the atmosphere. This mattered because 18th century war was never just tactics and bravery. Weather could reduce discipline, speed, and even survival before an enemy line did. The Revolution kept reminding everyone that nature did not care which side had the better speech. 49. In the South, the war often looked less like redcoats versus rebels, and more like neighbor versus neighbor with imperial uniforms layered on top. Loyalists, patriots, militias, raids, reprisals, and personal grudges turned the region into a civil conflict inside a larger war. Political loyalty could move right through a family or a county line. The Revolution was founding a nation while also splitting communities down to the bone. 50. Yorktown became the famous closing image because it deserves fame, but the visual is wrong if you imagine one purely American triumphal scene. What trapped Cornwallis was a combined operation, Washington and Rochambeau marching south, French troops tightening the siege, and the French Navy blocking rescue at the Chesapeake. The British Army was cornered by coordination. One of America's most celebrated victories required a very international kind of pressure. The file has widened now. Tea chests became counterfeit notes. Prison ships divided native diplomacy, and an army that needed French ships to make its biggest victory stick. The second half gets even less tidy. 51 on the Yorktown did not end the war overnight. Despite the way patriotic timelines like to clap their hands and go home there, fighting continued elsewhere, negotiations dragged on, and peace took paperwork, distance, and time. The military collapse at Yorktown made continuation politically difficult for Britain, but it did not freeze the entire Atlantic world on cue. Founding myths adore final scenes. Real wars prefer trailing complications. 52. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 handed the new United States boundaries stretching to the Mississippi River, which was breathtakingly generous for a rebellion that had spent much of the war nearly broke. Diplomatic success moved faster than internal stability. On paper, the Republic suddenly looked enormous. On the ground, much of that map was contested, occupied, or claimed by people who had not consented to being folded into an American future. Er zou verteidiger at 53. Fishing rights might sound like a sleepy detail next to surrender ceremonies, but they mattered enough to become a serious issue in the peace settlement. New England's economy depended heavily on access to North Atlantic fisheries, and nations do not survive on symbolism alone. A revolution can declare universal principles all day. It still has to ask who gets the cod. History becomes much easier to understand once food appears in the scene. 54. Tens of thousands of loyalists left the United States during and after the war, heading to Canada, Britain, the Caribbean, or other parts of the empire. Their losses were real. Property seized, neighbors turned hostile futures, abruptly relocated. The revolution created refugees on a large scale. Independence looks cleaner when everyone in the frame seems thrilled by it. The record shows a much more crowded and bitter departure line. 55. For Black loyalist, evacuation could mean something even more dramatic than political relocation. It could mean escape from slavery through British lines and transport out of the new United States. Registers like the Book of Negroes tried to track those departures, turning freedom into names on paper before the ship sailed. The revolution's moral contradictions remained intact, but so did the agency of people who used wartime chaos to pry open an exit. 56. Nova Scotia did not deliver easy lives to many of those Black loyalists. Harsh climate discrimination, broken promises, and limited land made freedom there painfully incomplete. Some later left again for Sierra Leone in West Africa, creating one of the most extraordinary migration chains to emerge from the Revolution. A war usually taught as the birth of one nation also scattered people across an Atlantic geography of unfinished survival. And 57. During the Revolution, Vermont operated as an independent republic before joining the United States in 1791. That means the map of the emerging nation was still improvising even, while textbooks later present it like a stable 13-piece set. Borders, loyalties, and governance were more experimental than the final patriotic package suggests. The Revolution did not simply free a country. It helped assemble one from regions still arguing over what they were. 58. The Articles of Confederation created a national government with no separate executive and no robust way to compel the states. That arrangement made sense to people who feared concentrated power, but it also made efficiency feel almost suspicious. The United States won independence under a system that could coordinate war while barely governing peace. The anti-king instinct was understandable. So was the administrative headache it left sitting in the chair afterward. 59. Even basic federal decisions could move slowly because major measures often required broad state agreement. And broad state agreement is a fragile machine even in calm times. In wartime, it bordered on performance art. Delegates came and went. Attendance faltered. Urgent needs hit procedural walls. The revolution was inventing self-government while discovering in real time how often self-government would choose delay over speed and local preference over shared necessity. 60 years. In December 1783, George Washington resigned his commission and gave up military power, a move that startled much of Europe, because victorious generals are not usually known for quietly handing back the sword. The act mattered symbolically because republics die young when armies become permanent ladders to personal rule. Washington did not make the nation perfect. He did help keep it from starting as a uniform with a government attached. 61. At Newburgh in 1783, angry officers frustrated over unpaid wages hovered near something dangerously close to a military political intervention. Washington diffused the mood, not with theatrical shouting, but with a small human moment. He put on his spectacles and noted he had grown gray in service to the country. The scene landed because it changed the emotional temperature of the room. Sometimes republics survive because someone resists the louder script. 62. Payment for soldiers and officers remained one of the young nation's recurring embarrassments. Men who had risked years of hardship often received promises, certificates, or delays instead of dependable compensation. A country founded in noble language kept sending veterans paperwork that did not fill stomachs. The moral glow of independence flickers a little once you watch the victorious army line up for what it was still owed and wait. 63. Land bounties became one way to compensate service when cash was scarce. Which sounds practical until you remember that land on paper is often land someone else already lives on. Rewarding veterans with Western claims tied military service to expansion, speculation, and future conflict. The Revolution's unpaid bills kept getting redirected toward frontier geography. This is how one war's shortage becomes another region's pressure system. 64. Westward hunger accelerated after independence because British restrictions on settlement beyond certain lines were gone or weakened, and many Americans saw the interior as reward opportunity or entitlement. For native nations, that meant the end of British rule did not bring safety. It brought a more aggressive settler republic, moving its appetite inland. The Revolution changed the flag above expansion. It did not reduce expansion's force. 65. The Oneida and Tuscarora supported the American side in significant ways, supplying scouts intelligence and direct military aid. Their choice later received far less protection than their help had earned. This is one of the Revolution's recurring patterns in miniature: alliance in crisis, neglect in victory. Political memory likes native support when it flatters the founding story. It grows quieter when the same story reaches land claims and broken promises. 66. For the Cherokee Creek and other native peoples on the southern frontier, the Revolution intensified instability rather than clarifying sovereignty. Raids, reprisals, encroachment, and wartime alliances turned the backcountry into a zone where imperial conflict and settler expansion overlapped. Independence did not arrive as a universal release. In many places, it arrived as faster pressure. Some people heard liberty in the new vocabulary. Others heard footsteps coming closer. 67. Revolutionary language opened political imagination for women, but it did not open the voting booth in any broad or immediate way. Republican motherhood praised women for shaping virtuous citizens, which is a polite way of assigning central civic responsibility without equal formal power. The new nation admired female influence most when it stayed indirect. Liberty in early American practice often preferred women as moral infrastructure rather than political equals. 68. In parts of the North, revolutionary ideals contributed to gradual abolition measures, legal challenges, and a growing discomfort with slavery's fit inside a republic built on natural rights language. The changes were uneven and incomplete, but they were real. Ideas can destabilize systems even when their authors do not intend full consequences. Once liberty gets printed enough times, somebody outside the approved audience eventually reads the line and asks hard questions. 69. In the South, however, slavery remained deeply entrenched and in some places strengthened after the war as plantation economies recovered and expanded. The Revolution did not solve the contradiction. It hardened it into a national inheritance. A republic speaking the language of freedom while protecting human bondage is not a side note to the American story. It is one of the story's central operating tensions visible from the start. 70. British emancipation offers during the war forced patriots into a particularly awkward mirror. The empire could present itself, however strategically, as a route to freedom for some enslaved people, while rebels invoking liberty often defended slavery at home. Nobody needed a graduate seminar to see the contradiction. It stood there in uniform and legal notices. The Revolution's rhetoric was soaring. Its social reality kept interrupting from the margins. 71. Voting rights did not suddenly become universal for white men in 1776. Many states retained property requirements or other restrictions that kept political participation narrower than later democratic mythology suggests. The Revolution widened possibility, but it did not flatten hierarchy on command. A lot of ordinary people heard radical language and expected radical results. Elite political design moved with much smaller steps and more locked doors. 72. Property qualifications mattered because they tied political voice to ownership. which made the republic sound more like a guardianship structure than a modern mass democracy. Independence changed sovereignty. It did not erase the suspicion many founders felt toward unfiltered popular rule. The public was celebrated in theory and filtered in practice. This gap between democratic language and restricted access did not arrive later. It came in with the furniture. 73. Religious liberty expanded, but established churches and old patterns of state support did not vanish overnight everywhere. Some states kept entanglements between government and preferred denominations longer than the simplified national story usually admits. The revolution made big principles available. Implementation moved state by state and often at a reluctant pace. Founding moments are excellent at making declarations. They are less efficient at clearing every inherited structure from the room. 74. Newspapers, broadsides, sermons, almanacs, and pamphlets made the revolution an information war long before that phrase sounded modern. Public opinion did not simply exist waiting to be measured. It was hammered into shape through print repetition and performance. Whoever controlled the story controlled morale, and morale controlled endurance. The war's paper trail is enormous because people understood, even then, that political reality depends heavily on what keeps circulating. 75. Committees of correspondence stitched distant communities into one argumentative network, carrying news, outrage, and strategy across colonial space faster than old political habits could comfortably absorb. They turned local incidents into shared grievances. That mattered because a revolution fails when every town thinks it is suffering alone. The committees helped create continental consciousness one letter at a time. Before there was a nation, there was a system for forwarding the problem. By now, the case file is not really about a few dramatic events. It is about a habit of simplification. The revolution gets remembered as clean because the full version leaves too many loose threads hanging in plain sight. 76. Washington's Culper Ring on Long Island and in New York proved that the revolution was fought with invisible labor as well as visible courage. Merchants' writers coded correspondence, and quiet observers built intelligence networks inside enemy-held territory. Good espionage looks boring until a bad decision exposes how necessary it was. The founding era had fewer gadgets than modern spy stories. It also had more laundry lines, merchant ledgers, and patient nerves. 77. Invisible ink code names masked handwriting, and concealed messages moved through the revolutionary world with surprising sophistication. Dr. James Jay's sympathetic stain let spies write letters that looked harmless until chemically revealed, which is delightfully theatrical for a war often presented as musket simplicity. Intelligence work thrives on ordinary surfaces pretending to be ordinary. The revolution did too. A lot of founding history hides inside paper that initially looks dull. 78. The Turtle, an early one-man submarine built by David Bushnell, tried to attack British ships underwater in 1776. It did not change the war, but it absolutely changed the level of ambition people were willing to bring to the problem. Imagine the nerves required to climb into a wooden underwater machine during the 18th century and call that a plan. The revolution's experimental streak was occasionally half genius, half dare. 79. Across the Hudson at West Point, an enormous iron chain was stretched to block British naval movement upriver. It was a brute force answer to a strategic problem, and it worked precisely because rivers are highways until someone turns them into barriers. Founding-era war was full of such material intelligence. Earthworks, pontoons, wagons, ferries, chains. Empires and rebellions alike depend on very physical solutions once speeches are done being admired. 80. Benedict Arnold's later betrayal is famous, but the specific target makes it even more startling. He tried to hand West Point, one of the most important American fortifications, to the British. That would have endangered communication and control along the Hudson Corridor in a devastating way. Treason rarely arrives dressed as a mustache-twirling abstraction. It usually comes with paperwork resentments and a map showing exactly what the enemy would gain. 81. Arnold becomes more historically interesting, not less. Once you stop treating him like a cartoon villain and start noticing the combustible mix of bravery, ego debt grievance, and humiliation around him. He had been a daring American commander before he turned. That does not excuse the act. It does explain the mechanism. The revolution kept generating men who believed deeply in honor and then discovered how unstable honor becomes when mixed with wounded ambition. 82. Washington never had wooden teeth. His dental appliances were made from combinations of ivory metal, human teeth, and animal teeth, which is both more accurate and somehow more unsettling than the myth. The wooden version survived because it sounds simple rustic and morally tidy, almost like frontier virtue lodged in the mouth. The real answer is uglier, wealthier, and more bodily. Founding myths love sanding discomfort into wholesome texture. 83. Betsy Ross probably did not sit in one perfect sewing moment and produce the first American flag exactly as later school lore describes. The story gained traction decades later and rests on family recollection more than hard contemporary evidence. That does not mean flags did not matter. It means memory likes assigning national symbols to one clean domestic origin. Even patriotic fabric apparently needed a better backstory than committee work could provide. 84. The Liberty Bell almost certainly did not ring out on July 4th, 1776, to announce independence to cheering crowds. The cracked story and the timing drifted together later into a pleasing package. Real bells, like real nations, are less cooperative than commemorations hope. The American Revolution keeps producing this same lesson. What survives in public memory is often the version with the clearest sound, not the strongest documentation. 85. Uniforms in the Revolution were often patched mismatched or improvised rather than perfectly standardized blocks of color. Hunting shirts, local militia clothing, civilian garments, and whatever could be issued or repaired all appeared in the same broad war. That visual disorder matters because it reminds you how provisional the whole enterprise remained for years. Nations are rarely born looking coordinated. Usually they arrive wearing several things at once. 86. Smoothbore muskets were inaccurate enough that massed volleys, timing, and proximity mattered more than the rifle sniper fantasies later audiences sometimes project backward. A musket could be deadly, but not with modern cinematic precision at long range. That changed how battles felt. Smoke, confusion, noise, and fear tightening distance until formation and nerve became decisive. The Revolution was not an elegant dual society. It was often a chaos machine with drill trying to contain it. 87. Once lines got close, bayonets and discipline could settle matters faster than marksmanship did. The point was not only to wound, it was to break cohesion, because an army that stops behaving like a unit becomes vulnerable immediately. Training mattered for exactly this reason. Panic spreads faster than orders. Many revolutionary soldiers feared the cold steel charge because it compressed the entire moral question of battle into a few terrifying seconds. 88. Fog on the East River helped cover Washington's retreat from Brooklyn in 1776, and that single atmospheric accident may have saved the Revolution's main army at its most fragile stage. Weather does not create discipline, but it can reward it. Boats moved. Men stayed quiet. A potential catastrophe slipped into survival. The founding of the United States contains tucked inside it a misty reminder that history occasionally hinges on moisture and timing. 89. Mudstorms, swollen rivers, road conditions, and seasonal timing influenced campaigns so constantly that the weather often functioned like an additional commanding officer nobody could court-martial. Supply wagons bogged down, marches slowed, ammunition suffered, hunger deepened. You can admire battlefield decisions all you want, but the Revolution's daily reality kept dragging boots through terrain that was making strategic choices of its own. Maps always look cleaner than roads ever were. 90. The American Revolution was not just a North American event with some French seasoning. It became a global war involving the Atlantic and the Caribbean European diplomacy, Indian Ocean concerns, and imperial calculations far from Boston or Yorktown. Britain had to think worldwide. That changed what was possible in America. The United States was born inside a conflict much larger than itself, which is both humbling and historically clarifying. Here's where the file starts closing in. Once you strip away the clean symbols, the pattern is hard to miss. The Revolution succeeded through contradiction, improvisation, outside help, and a memory system that later polished the roughest edges. 91. At Yorktown, the French fleet's control of the Chesapeake mattered as much as the trenches tightening on land. Without that naval barrier, Cornwallis might have been reinforced or evacuated, and the famous American ending would look very different. This is one of the most important correctives to solitary national pride in the whole war. Independence was not won by grit alone. It was won by timing plus alliance plus blockade. Uzak 92. Wartime debt lingered after the peace, and the burden helped convince many leaders that the existing national structure was too weak for the future. Loans had to be managed, credit had to be restored, obligations had to be honored somehow. The Republic had survived militarily while looking financially unstable, which is not a comfortable long-term pose. Victory solved the British problem. It did not solve the bookkeeping. 93. The Constitution of 1787 did not emerge out of thin civic genius. It grew partly from revolutionary weakness, unpaid soldiers, fractured finance, interstate suspicion, and a government under the Articles that could inspire, but not reliably enforce. The founding had a sequel because the first arrangement kept wobbling. America's political architecture was revised by people who had already watched one system strain under pressure and decided sentiment alone was not load-bearing. 94. Canada did not join the rebellion, despite American hopes and an early failed invasion that suggested the new cause expected a broader northern reception than it got. That matters because it reminds you independence was not an automatic continental wave waiting to happen. Geography alone does not decide political imagination. The revolution spread unevenly, and some places looked at the Patriot pitch and declined the subscription entirely. 95. Florida was British when the revolution began, and by the peace settlement, it had returned to Spanish control. That is a useful corrective to the tidy East Coast classroom map, because borders and sovereignty in the era were far more fluid than later national memory implies. The American Revolution shifted multiple imperial relationships at once. The flag story sounds simpler. The territorial story keeps moving pieces after the narrator should have stopped. 96. Early in the crisis, many colonists blame Parliament and ministers more than George III himself, which means the king was not always the immediate cartoon villain later narratives imply. Political blame hardened over time. That evolution matters. Revolutions do not usually begin with total clarity about who the true enemy is. They begin with overlapping grievances, failed appeals, and a public slowly revising where it thinks ultimate responsibility lives. 97. No taxation without representation was powerful, but it was also narrower than the universal democratic slogan it later became. For many people, shouting it representation did not mean votes for women, freedom for enslaved people, or equal political standing for everyone under the sky. The phrase mattered. The limits mattered too. Founding slogans often arrive wearing more moral grandeur than their first users intended to share. 98. Ordinary soldiers, artisans, farmers, and debtors often expected the revolution to produce deeper social leveling than elite leaders wanted. Wartime sacrifice creates moral claims, and those claims do not quietly vanish at peace. Petitions, protests, and later unrest made that clear. The people who carried the burden of independence sometimes discovered that new rulers can become cautious very quickly once the old rulers have finally left the room. 99. Later commemorations smoothed out the arguments, the missed payments, the divided loyalties, the foreign assistance, and the exclusions because nations prefer origin stories that behave themselves. Monuments are cleaner than archives. Schoolbook timelines are cleaner than ship manifests, pension files, and abandoned homes. The American Revolution was turned into a moral mural over time. The original version had far more stains, edits, and voices talking over one another. 100. The Revolution was both an anti-imperial rebellion and a settler expansion project, which is exactly the kind of double-truth public memory struggles to hold in one hand. It challenged British authority, while also opening new pressures on native land and preserving deep inequalities inside the new republic. This does not make the revolution meaningless. It makes it real. Founding history is usually most revealing at the point where its virtues and harms overlap. 101. The most mind-blowing fact may be that the American Revolution worked at all. A divided population, a weak central government, expiring enlistments, collapsing currency, foreign dependence, internal contradiction, and an empire with vastly greater resources still produced a lasting break. That outcome was not inevitable, pure, or simple. It was an improbable coalition of endurance holding together just long enough to become a country, and then spending generations arguing over what kind. A folded uniform in a cedar chest, a cracked bell preserved behind glass, and a treaty map drying on a table all tell the same quiet story. Nations are not born as cleanly as they later describe themselves. The American Revolution endures not because it was simple, but because it fused courage, improvisation, contradiction, and selective memory into one usable national origin. Which fact from this file do you think should have been taught in every classroom from the start? Subscribe if you want more history that keeps the Polish off.